Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Maloney. I'm the Executive Director and the Acting Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening for what has become an annual event for us with Tim Gould and the World Energy Outlook. Today is the launch of the 2021 edition of this annual report. Of course, the timing is particularly important given the proximity to the next COP meeting in Glasgow, which we'll talk about, no doubt. And really, it's, Tim, a real pleasure to welcome you back to Paris, to PSIA. Last year, of course, it was an online version, but we're delighted to be back in our usual space at the usual time to receive this very important and, as we just said, timely report from you. Thank you once again for being here. I will hand over immediately to Giacomo Luciani, who I'm sure many of you know is one of our long-standing professors. In fact, he's been part of the Masters in International Energy since it was established at PSIA 10 years ago. And so we're delighted that he also is continuing this tradition. And shortly you'll also hear from a couple of people who were in the same seats as you, one of our students from last year and one of our graduates from a few years ago. But again, I'll let Giacomo introduce them properly. So without further ado, let me hand over, please, to Giacomo and wish you all an excellent event.
Thank you, Mark. And indeed, the presentation of the WIO has been a highlight of the season, so to speak, now for several years. And we are always very pleased to have Tim Gould with us presenting, as he does very brilliantly, you will see in a moment. And this has been one of the ways in which we have grown a proximity with the International Energy Agency. We are very fortunate, of course, that the International Energy Agency is in Paris. And progressively, we have had staff from the agency teach in the master. We have had our students go to the agency as interns, and then in some cases employees, even long-term employees. It gives me great pleasure to read the acknowledgement page in the World Energy Outlook, in which several names of our students appear. Some of them are in the room. and this year we had fully 7 students who went to the agency as interns, and some might stay longer. So that, to me, is a huge success, and I am very grateful to Tim personally and to the agency, to Fatih Birol also, that has been very close to what we have been doing. And it is really an important relationship for us. So, without further ado, we have many things to discuss. It is a crucial time because of COP26, because the price of gas is where it is, across the roof, because the price of oil is where it is, not quite across the roof, but close, because the price of carbon allowances is where it is, and so on and so forth. I spare you the follow-up, but we are witnessing an across-the-board increase in prices, which is not to be taken lightly.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Luciani, and thanks very much, Mark, Acting Dean, for these kind words. I can only echo that from our perspective, we count ourselves very lucky to be in the same city as such an institution as this. We benefit hugely from the quality of and enthusiasm of the students that come across and help us at the IEA, and I think that also speaks to the quality of the program and the quality of the teaching that you get. This is actually the first time I've sat in front of a live audience for the best part of 2 years, so it feels quite unfamiliar not to be surrounded by screens, but it's a useful reintroduction to life as usual. However, the WEO has changed a bit since over the time when I've had the chance to come and talk to you. It used to be, I remember not so fondly, 2019, an 800-page tome, which was, I have to say, a real challenge to produce. Last year was an exceptional year. We released the WEO a month early in October, just because we felt that events were moving so fast that we needed to sort of catch the wave a bit and react to some of the remarkable things that happened to energy in 2020. 2021 turned into another exceptional year because we released the WEO a month early, but this time because we wanted to catch the debate in the run-up to what seems to us to be a crucial meeting of COP26 in Glasgow. And as you rightly say, it's not just the run-up to COP, but we've seen a really extraordinary run-up in prices over the last few months, affecting coal markets, particularly in gas markets, electricity, carbon, you name it, and we'll come back to that in a second. I would, though, like to point out that this year, for the first time, the World Energy Outlook is free. So we're not charging anyone for the Outlook this year, and it comes with a sort of basic or essential data package as well. So we hope that that makes people's lives slightly easier when it comes to absorbing some of the things that we've done. We are saying that this is, again, an exceptional thing for 2021. I know this is being recorded, but I can probably say that I very much hope that we continue to make it available for free in the future, because I think that has to be the way to go. I'm going to run through some of the key findings from the Outlook now, and then look forward very much to the comments from Audrey and Anne, and then, as ever, to the reactions from you all, and we hope to get through as many of those topics as we can. A few elements of context. I've spoken a little bit about the sharp spikes in prices. From the IEA's perspective, it is misleading to talk about this as, in a sense, a crisis of clean energy, as some people are doing. The reasons that we're seeing for the run-up in prices have a lot to do with the nature of a rapid rebound in economic activity this year. They have a lot to do with some weather-related factors that are increasingly important when you're looking to analyze the energy sector. So this year we had a long, cold winter in Europe that extended well into the second quarter and depleted gas storage. You had incidents in mid-year, a drought in Brazil that meant that Brazil was taking a lot more LNG from the international market than usual. You had various heat waves and other things that pushed up electricity demand elsewhere. So that contributed to the demand side for gas. And then you also had a lot of planned and unplanned outages to gas supply that have really contributed to market tightness this year. Some of that is because maintenance to facilities was not possible in 2020 due to the pandemic. That was all postponed to 2021. That took a lot more supply off the market, or a lot more supply off the market than you'd normally have. And then there's just been a series of unplanned outages that have removed different bits of supply from the market at different times over the last few months. And the combination of all that has really led to the sorts of things that we're seeing at the moment. I'm happy to come back to that when we discuss. But another very important element of the backdrop here, and a topic that we'll come back to, is this notion that a new global energy economy is emerging. That's quite different from the one that we may be familiar with from previous decades. It's more electrified, it's more interconnected, it's more digital. You can argue it's more efficient, although we can get back into that. And it's certainly cleaner than the one we've had before. But let's also be aware, I mean, we are now meeting in person here, and to some degree you can feel life coming back to normal, but that is not the case in many parts of the world that still are in the middle of a very serious public health crisis that has really sapped political attention, it's diverted money into emergency spending of all the different types, and that's really removed some of the energy that you'd need for a more sustainable recovery. And one of the findings that we have in the new outlook is that after some years where you had a steady decrease in the number of people without access to electricity, for example, that has really stalled in 2020, and we expect it to continue to stall in 2021. So there's an urgent need to give some renewed momentum to that, and that need is most visible in sub-Saharan Africa. So the bottom line for us, as we come into a crucial meeting of COP26 in Glasgow, climate ambitions never been higher, but if you actually look at the data coming from energy markets, and particularly the likelihood of quite a large rise in emissions this year, that just doesn't match the rhetoric that we're hearing from policymakers. And so the intention of this World Energy Outlook, it's a particularly climate-focused outlook, because what we wanted to do is just to take stock of where we stand in the run-up to a crucial meeting at COP. What do the announced pledges mean? So all the things we've heard from governments about net zero by 2050 or carbon neutrality by 2060, all the updated nationally determined contributions. If you add them all together, where does that get us? Where does that get our energy system? And what more do we need to do to get on track for a 1.5 degree stabilization? And we have a new benchmark for that 1.5 degree stabilization because, as many of you will be aware, earlier this year we published a so-called roadmap to net zero by 2050, what it would take the world as a whole to get to net zero emissions by mid-century. And that, as I'm sure you're aware, is an outcome that would, from the energy sector's perspective, would be consistent with a 1.5 degree stabilization in the rise in global temperatures. But it's not just about climate. I mean, especially given the energy market situation that we have at the moment, we have to be aware that energy security or affordability, these things don't diminish in importance as we go along. I'm very conscious of the fact that when we model our scenarios, we end up with nice, smooth lines heading out into the middle distance and then all the way across to 2050. Our modeling, we model a system that is in equilibrium. You know, investment rises to meet the needs for energy services in different parts of the system. But the world isn't like that. There is always imbalances between supply and demand. There are always reasons why investment might fall short or exceed what is actually required. So we need to be thinking constantly in terms of what is the potential for future volatility? What are the disjointed elements of a transition that we need to anticipate? And I think you could argue that that applies to energy markets, but you can also certainly argue that applies to the sort of geopolitics of energy and the way that nations cooperate or don't cooperate to try and achieve climate goals. So that, by way of a slightly extended introduction, gets me to the world that we looked at a few years ago. So what do we think about for the future of energy and emissions before Paris? And if we cast our minds back to a sort of pre-Paris baseline, so this is some modeling that we did essentially looking at elements of continuity before the Paris Agreement was signed, steady increase in CO2 emissions, world continuing to rely very heavily on fossil fuels. And it should be very clear that that would lead to truly catastrophic climate change. However, in the meantime, since Paris, countries have put in place a range of policies, particularly in the power sector with the rise of renewables, the cost reductions that you've seen for some key renewable technologies. China's played a large role in that as well, in bringing some aspects of that curve down. And now in a sense, our baseline, our read on the future of energy, based on the things that we can see in place today, shows a flattening of emissions. Now, a flattening of emissions is significant, but it's far from enough. We still, in 2050, be pumping well over 30 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And as we're all aware, if you want to stabilize global temperatures, you don't just have to stabilize emissions, you have to actually get them down to net zero. So this trajectory, the stated policy scenario, is consistent with, at the end of the century, a rise in global average temperatures of around 2.6, 2.7 degrees Celsius. And because you're not at net zero, that curve is still upwards. So there's still upward pressure on temperatures in the direction that we're heading at the moment. So better than pre-Paris, but certainly no solution. And that's why the Paris Agreement's very clear. You need to ratchet up ambitions over time. And as of today, countries accounting for 50% of global emissions have put forward new ambitions for 2030. And countries accounting for almost 70% of emissions have put forward different types of long-term net zero pledges. So what we wanted to do in this outlook is really look at what does that all mean, and the result is in our new sort of announced pledges scenario, you do get a decline in global emissions. Now, that's not enough, but let's be aware of what a new departure that would be for the global energy economy. Because every decade since the start of the Industrial Revolution has seen rising CO2 emissions. And so we are now finally at a point where if countries do what they say they're going to do, then we will have the coexistence of a growing economy, in practice a flattening of global energy demand, and a 40% reduction in global energy-related emissions to 2050. So we will have broken quite a significant global trend. And that would be a turning point for emissions. It would also have quite significant implications for energy markets. So again, with today's policy settings, the future looks quite similar to the past, at least over the period to 2030. Continued growth in oil demand, continued relatively strong growth in gas demand, and of course, you would have continued momentum behind renewables, particularly in the power sector with solar and wind. The announced pledges, they really do change that picture. So already by 2025, you have a flattening in global oil use and then a decline. Key reason for that would be the acceleration that you'd see in the electrification of mobility. Number of countries, major countries, have already committed to phasing out sales of cars with internal combustion engines. Some major car manufacturers have also committed to 100% sales of zero emissions vehicles by 2030, some cases 2035 or 2040. So that starts to feed through quite strongly into the global picture. Similar position on gas. Rapid changes in the power sector start to bring down gas demand for power. Gas moves slightly more towards a balancing role rather than a baseload role for electricity generation. And you also see, in countries with net zero pledges, you start to see gas demand in the building sector for residential heating going down as well. There are countries around the world, the UK yesterday started to put in place quite significant incentives for households to swap out their gas boilers for heat pumps. Now, many people argue in the UK that the amount of money that's dedicated to that is not sufficient, but it's a start. And so those are the sorts of things that you would have to see in countries that are committed to net zero emissions. And naturally enough, in that scenario, you would need to see an even more rapid expansion in renewable technologies led by wind and solar. Announced pledges would also change the picture for coal. I don't need to remind such a well-informed audience, but coal is still the single largest source of global emissions. Roughly 35 gigatons of emissions from the energy sector each year. Coal is about 15 of those, and coal in the power sector is about 10. So that's the single largest element of the global emissions picture. And it's also one that should be vulnerable to change, because we have cost-effective technologies in the power sector that it's easy to imagine that they should be able to displace large amounts of coal-fired power. And the first task is to stop building new coal-fired power plants. That's something that we have singularly failed to do up till now. That is an awful lot. What you're looking at on the screen is an awful lot of new coal coming into the system over the last 3 decades. At the start of this year, there's more than 9,000 coal plants in operation worldwide, located in nearly 100 countries. And if all of the existing plants were to continue to operate kind of unchecked, that's half your emissions budget for a 1.5 degree stabilization. That's just gone already. So it's clear that this remains very central to the task of stabilizing global temperatures. Looking forward, there's about 140 gigawatts of coal-fired power now under construction, and I mean, many more than that in various elements of the planning stage. So this becomes quite a crucial battleground in a way for the future of global emissions. And you can see that there's a lot of pressure on governments, on financial institutions to curb or remove the possibility for new coal-fired plants to receive funding. And one particularly significant announcement came at the UN General Assembly when President Xi Jinping of China said that China would no longer build new coal-fired power plants abroad. So what we wanted to do is also see what sort of impact could that have. And so we looked at all of the countries that still build coal-fired plants in our announced pledges scenario and say, well, which of those have traditionally relied on China for either EPC contracting or finance? And that announcement could be very significant. So that's 190 gigawatts of coal-fired power could be removed from the equation from that Chinese announcement. And to give you a sense of what that means, if those plants were to operate for a reasonably standard lifetime for coal, that's about 20 gigatons of emissions, cumulative emissions. Now, if you also look at what would Europe going to net zero by 2050 save in terms of global emissions compared with our stated policy scenario, that's also about 20 gigatons. So this one Chinese announcement to remove, that could remove these coal-fired plants from the equation could have the same impact on emissions as everything that we're going to be doing in Europe to get to net zero. However, there are still emissions coming from the existing fleet of coal-fired plants, and that's one of the key reasons why that line for the announced pledges scenario doesn't go lower than it does. Announced pledges get us to, if we make reasonable assumptions about what happens after 2050, that gets us to around a 2.1 degree stabilization. Oh, it's not stabilization because you don't reach net zero emissions, but 2.1 degrees rise by the end of the century. So you're getting close to the sorts of ranges that are being discussed in the Paris Agreement, but still some way off. And if you look at the physical science report from AR6, or the first of the volumes of AR6 that was published a few months ago, you can see that there's a very big difference in terms of the outcomes for the planet between 2 degrees and 1.5. So there's still a lot more to be done. And if you look at that remaining gap, we focused in particular on the gap in 2030. So what measures could actually help us to increase ambition over the next 10 years? Because that seemed to us to be the most relevant question to ask in the light of the countries coming together in Glasgow. And there's two important findings for us. One is that if you look at the geographical composition, who needs to step up in order to fill that gap? Essentially, the answer is everyone. I mean, there is a perception that, advanced economies and maybe China have kind of done their job, and now it's up to India and Indonesia to come to the table. Well, half of that gap needs to be filled by increased ambition from those countries that already have net zero pledges. So to strengthen those pledges further, but particularly I think there's a case for China to become more ambitious in the way that it thinks about its near-term emissions trajectory. And then the rest comes from the rest of the world. And then the other striking thing for us is when we look at what needs to fill that gap. So there's a 14 gigaton, it's CO2 equivalent because methane's involved, but 14 gigatons worth of emissions that we need to in a sense, abate to close that gap in 2030. And 40% of that is what we would consider cost-effective, so it results in cost savings for consumers. So it's tough for us to understand why stuff that is cost-effective is not on the table in Glasgow. There's no sort of economic rationale for holding back there. And what are the elements that are cost-effective? It's some of the low-cost renewable technologies that could be deployed more rapidly, in our view. So wind and solar, as well as some other power sector, particularly low-emission sources of power. That's the single largest way that you can close the gap. So clean electrification, very much part of that story. Another big element for us is methane abatement. So methane, as I think we're all aware, very potent greenhouse gas. A lot of methane just leaks to the atmosphere from fossil fuel operations. It feels strange to say at a time when sort of gas is scarce, but 180 billion cubic meters of gas, in our estimation, is just lost through pipes, through various other aspects of often poor performance, but also inadequate information and inadequate supervision and awareness amongst fossil fuel producers. 180 billion cubic meters, that's pretty much the amount that Russia delivers to Europe in an average year. So this is a non-negligible amount of gas that is just escaping into the atmosphere. And in our view, there are very cost-effective ways in order to trap that. And indeed, because you can trap it and sell it, the value of the gas that you capture is often greater than the cost of the abatement measure. There's efficiency policies that can be brought into play in all of the areas that you'd imagine, appliances, but I think things like trucks are important here because electrification is that much more difficult, so fuel efficiency in those areas plays a very important role, as well as opportunities to push electrification harder, and so on. And if needs be, we can come back in the Q&A. So what about the other 60% of reductions? But okay, we can come back to that. Another way to think about the changes in the energy system that I've talked about is to look at how energy-related trade evolves in different scenarios. So this is the picture today. No surprise, oil is the most valuable commodity out there. It dominates the value of international trade. But one element that I wouldn't have been able to show if I had been showing this chart a year or two ago is this one in the bottom right-hand corner. So critical minerals. We did some work earlier this year on all of those elements that feed into a clean energy system. At the moment, this is dominated by copper. So copper's obviously crucial for transmission lines and for all manner of electrical equipment. But in here as well are things like cobalt and lithium and nickel and rare earth elements that are also crucial components of many clean energy technologies. So we fully integrated that now into our view of what the energy system needs and what is moved around the world in our modeling. Let's look at what happens in that announced pledges scenario in 2050. Oil continues to be a very sort of pivotal part of that system, but it's actually quite a different set of trading patterns that you'd have by then, because by then European Union, China, still big importers today. I mean, they've really moved away from oil for many parts of their energy system. And so you have this concentration of oil flows between big resource-owning countries, particularly in the Middle East, and other developing economies in Asia. But you see also some new kids on the block here, hydrogen coming in as a traded commodity. That's, in this scenario, that has a lot to do with the fact that key countries in Northeast Asia, so led by Japan, but also Korea, they have net zero pledges. They don't have opportunities, in a sense, for CCUS in many cases. Low carbon hydrogen seems to be a very attractive opportunity for them to decarbonize difficult bits of their economy, but they don't have a particularly strong renewable resource in some cases. They don't have natural gas resources, so they need to bring that low carbon hydrogen in. And there is a sort of 3 to 4 time variation in production costs in our modeling for low carbon hydrogen. So some countries, notably Australia, bits of the Middle East, some countries in Latin America start to export, and that starts to feed across into Northeast Asia particularly. And that's the start of a new set of trading relationships in that scenario. It's not necessarily transported as hydrogen. A lot of it might be as ammonia or hydrogen-rich fuels, but we can come back to that. And those sorts of developments then dominate the scene once you get to a net zero emissions system. So 80% of global energy-related trade by then is critical minerals and hydrogen. So that completely upturns the sorts of trade that we see today. I'd like to say a few words about investment now, because the IEA has a reputation for talking a lot about potential mismatches in investment across different parts of the energy sector. And what we wanted to signal in this World Energy Outlook is that these mismatches are becoming really quite acute. So in the case of oil and gas, you're all aware, 2014, 2015, big drop in the oil price. 2020, another big drop in the oil price. And each time, companies were spending less on new oil and gas supply. So the amount of money going into oil and gas production today is around half of what it was in 2014. But as you're also aware, oil and gas demand hasn't been halved over the last 7 years. I mean, in fact, we're broadly speaking where we are or higher than we were. Now, that isn't quite as dramatic as it sounds, just because oil companies in the meantime, or oil and gas companies, are much leaner and fitter, and they do much more. They can make that money work much harder than they have in the past. But still, it's striking to us that when we look at all of the different elements of the investment picture, one of the very few that is aligned with our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario is the amount of investment going into oil and gas. And so you can reach the conclusion that today's money going into that part of the energy sector is consistent with a world of stagnant or even declining demand. I mean, just as a reminder that in that net zero scenario, we have continued investment in existing fields, but we don't have any new field approvals for oil and gas after 2021. And if we look at the other side of the picture in a way, looking at the amount of money going into transitions, going into clean energy infrastructure, that was much more resilient in 2020, and we expect another uptick this year. But it's really a long way short of what we think would be needed in order to meet rising demand for energy services sustainably. So, in a way, this dislocation, that cannot persist. You know, something has to give, because unless you sort out the right-hand side of the picture, then what you're looking at on the left-hand side of the picture is not going to be enough to maintain a reliable energy system. And so the solution for us is clear. We need to be working extremely hard on that right-hand side of the picture to scale up spending on clean energy technology, on deployment, on infrastructure. But there's a long way to go to make that a reality. And in the meantime, the longer this picture persists, the more likely we would be to see continued episodes of sharp price swings or volatility in energy markets. Big part of the discussion at the moment around international energy is, so what does that mean for people? What does it mean for households? And I wanted to try and illustrate that with some analysis that we did, looking not at a price shock that happens today, but what if a price shock happens in different scenarios 10 years down the road? What happens if we have a price shock in 2030? I want to illustrate what that looks like in different visions of the future. And the first thing to understand is that if you take an average household, there's no such thing as an average household, but if you were to take an average household energy bill, then around half of it today goes on oil products by value, about a third on electricity, and then if you're living in a country, in the northern hemisphere, you've probably got quite a significant heating bill as well, typically paid for with natural gas. In our stated policy scenario, on average, that bill would go up over the next 10 years. The structure of your spending wouldn't change dramatically, a little bit more electricity for mobility, maybe, but essentially that's a reflection of the fact that we anticipate slightly higher oil and gas prices over the next few years compared with the average over the previous few years. But if you go for a rapid energy transition, then that spending, those bills would be 10% lower in 2030 compared with today. Why is that? Because you've got more efficient appliances in your house. Your air conditioning is more efficient. Your buildings are maybe retrofitted or built to a higher standard of energy efficiency. There's a greater chance that you'll be plugging your car in rather than filling it with petrol. There's a greater chance that you'll also be electrifying your heating, perhaps with one of those heat pumps I was talking about earlier, rather than using a gas or other fueled boiler. And so if we shock these systems then in 2030, it's less costly to households in that rapid transition scenario. So that leads us to conclude that, when you're dealing with volatility in these commodity markets, the sorts of things that you need to do in transitions are quite helpful. But all of this doesn't come for free. You have to invest in efficiency. You have to invest in new appliances. You have to put the upfront cost down for an electric vehicle or a heat pump. And some households are capable of doing that. But in other cases, there is a need for some support from governments to allow particularly poorer households to take on those upfront costs. They deliver lower lifetime savings, but you have to manage the sort of investment needs of that change. So, final slide. I wanted to come back to something I mentioned up front, which this notion of a new global energy economy, and illustrate that here. So this is taken from our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, and it just tries to juxtapose a little bit what the opportunities for growth and employment are in that scenario compared with things that we know today. So if you just look at the market size for equipment, key pieces of equipment that you need in a clean energy system: fuel cells, electrolyzers, battery packs, wind turbines, solar PV modules. So the annual market size available to manufacturers of that equipment would exceed 1 trillion by mid-century. And that's, broadly speaking, equivalent to the size of today's oil market. So there's clearly enormous prospects there for companies that are well positioned along this set of global supply chains. And there's opportunities in other areas too, handling low carbon gases in that scenario as well. So low carbon hydrogen, biogases, and so on. That's the volume of gases that you would be dealing with in 2050 is half the size of today's global gas market. So fuel suppliers, they don't disappear from the picture, but they have a different set of tasks in a net zero emissions system. And with that, a few concluding thoughts. I think we talked a little bit at the start about at least our perception of the factors that underlie today's turbulence in markets. And our analysis, I hope, has emphasized that the sorts of things that you need to do in transitions help you manage volatility over time. Now, there are also very respectable reasons to assume that that system inherently becomes more volatile because you're dealing with, greater variability on the supply side of your electricity supply, and as well as arguably more variability on the demand side. So there's a very interesting discussion there. But I think just in the way that we think about today's market turbulence, I think we need to have that context very clear. I spoke about the opportunities for us to move beyond announced pledges. And I think it's worth just keeping in mind that many of those are extremely cost effective. But as our executive director has been fond of saying over the last few weeks, what's the quote? I never promised you a rose garden. This is no one should imagine that this is going to be plain sailing. This is tough. And there's all sorts of possibilities for things to get out of sequence, for countries to, or internationally, for there to be elements of a disjointed transition. And that's particularly true if we continue to see this mismatch on the investment side. But let's not forget either the size of the prize, not just in climate terms, but also in terms of growth and employment. And finally, as we look ahead to COP26, energy transitions depend on many different stakeholders, civil society, investors, companies, individuals. But let's keep in mind that no one really has the same capacity as governments to move things onto towards a safer place. And that's why it's completely right that all eyes should be on Glasgow and looking for that really unmistakable signal that they are committed to a cleaner and more resilient energy system in the future. And with that, well, thank you very, very much, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. Lots of food for thought. We have two discussants that we lined up, both from the House, in the sense that Audrey Quehen, who is now an important executive at ENGIE, is an alumna of SciencesPo. Unfortunately for her, for time when the International Energy Master did not exist, but she managed anyhow to undergo a brilliant career in energy. And it's always very important for us to tighten up our relations with the alumni of SciencesPo, which are a great source of networks and knowledge. And then we have Geschke, who is a second-year master student, and she's currently interning at a Swiss electricity company called Axpo. I asked her to represent the voice of the missing group, the ones that we only meet today or in these days after a full year of seeing each other on Zoom, but not knowing whether, on Zoom you see the faces, but you don't know, is he tall, is he? There are other characteristics that you miss. So, you want to come up? Perhaps this is easier. and take the floor for your observations and questions. Now, one good thing about the WIO being for free this year is that I have been able to distribute it widely, so many of you have already received the book, and we'll have a few questions based on the book. The second good thing is that it takes away from my conscience, because I use always to distribute it anyhow.
Yeah. There were some very hard-working PDFs in the old days.
Although this was not expected to be the case, so now I can do so legally. And you said?
Yeah. I can take my mask off.
Yeah, you can take it off.
Hi. Thank you for having me on this panel today. I have a bit more of a commentary for discussion based on the WIO rather than a lot of different questions. So one day in January 2050, we're going to wake up and we will have a beautiful, functioning, peaceful society that flourishes not based on fossil fuels, but based on renewable resources. A morning, a year in which we get up and enter a world that is not at odds, but in synchronization with this planet. The WIO shows clearly this year that this is not magic. This doesn't just happen just like that. In fact, this WIO is an illustration of how far we still have to go to reach the goal that we set ourselves. And it's not an exaggeration to say that this goal is nothing less than the survival of the society that we have, of the human species on this planet, maybe even. Seeing as it is that, an illustration, it comes with a few considerations that may only be seen between the lines. And those considerations, or a few of them, I want to highlight for our discussion today moving forward. And they have to do with how humans and how we act or may not act in accordance with what maybe should be the best for us. So let's take a look at governments and their commitments. Thanks to this WIO, we can clearly see that there's a difference between rhetoric and action, and that lies in the cruelty of reality. It's a lot of missing MIAs, missing in actions, where even if all declared changes were achieved, we would still be far off the 1.5 degree warming. So with ambition and even implementation gaps in front of us, what is holding us back from putting our action where our mouth is? And who is we to begin with? We, a big one, is governments, and more specifically, it's rich governments in the developed world. And then another big one is the citizens living in those governments. They have interests that need to be appealed to, they have comforts to be upkept, they have fear of change. And these people and their governments who make or break the transition, or they may make or break the transition to a large degree. First, what happens is inside. Misinformation, like on how power outages and taxes were due to renewables, play an important role that we need to not forget. It instills fear. And people in fight or flight mode are unwilling to listen, they are unwilling to consider change, and they are even less willing to help others. And this fear is really picking up, that situations like those in the UK or in China may arise elsewhere, that established governments or the establishment may not have the citizens' interests at heart. In cycles of elections, these considerations massively influence the willingness of governments to push for radical change, and that is what we really need. Second, there's also the question of spending money. The WIO points to a huge finance gap, one that exists not only in our own rich country backyards, but in the rest of the world. Yet governments, even in countries like Germany, are struggling to find financing for their own transitions. How will financing be made available in emerging markets, when they may be unstable, when there may not be a government capable of implementing change, when there is no simple recipe for development to begin with? When the WIO points out that the right investment is difficult to attain and we will need a direction for the correct direction, all these confounding factors leave me wondering, how will we do it? And this is not where it ends. The third and final important issue that I want to bring up today is the emergence of a new era of geopolitics. The pandemic has shown that in emergency situations, national interests can overcome governments in a quest to ensure stability and security in their own nations. This energy transition, no matter how quick it will be, it does not seem any different. Critical minerals and rare earth materials play a crucial role in an energy transition. But who will care about the supply of batteries when they are lacking in one's own country, when they are not elsewhere? And who should care? Priorities, at least for governments and individuals, tend to be focused on the self first and the other second. Of course, everyone would like to have a more equitable world. But what about the citizens of the privileged world and their living standards? What about us, not as a singular me or you, but as a collective? Would we elect governments that impose severe changes, perhaps even restraints, and that at the same time look beyond national boundaries to help the energy transition elsewhere, all on the basis of a promise of lower cost or something else on the horizon eventually? These questions are directly implied when we start speaking about the realization of net zero ambitions or other lower emissions paths set out by the WEO. So to close off, how do we ensure that no one gets lost in transition? How do we not lose a transition to fear, false information, or processes that cannot keep up? Who is we, and how does it become more inclusive? So these are just some thoughts that I had in the reading and in the seeing of the presentation of the WEO. There's clearly a massive challenge ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to further discussion.
Audrey.
Thank you, Professor Luciani, for your invitation, and thank you, Mr. Gould, for your presentation and for providing us this analysis and key findings of the energy transition. I will have two commentaries. The World Energy Outlook illustrates the choices that face the world's decision makers in the run-up of the crucial 26th COP in November and beyond. A sustainable, secure, and affordable transition is necessary to reach the climate ambition. In your introduction, you highlighted that it will mean more electrified, more connected, more digital, and more sustainable investments. As I understand, it's not only a transition, it's a global transformation of our economies, saying that. And there is something that could play a role to reach the climate goal, is sectorial integration and trans-sectorial integration. By using the best of all energy sources and by decarbonizing them in the most cost-effective way and in the most inclusive way. For example, as we see, gas will still play a big role in the medium term, and there is a potential for the development of green gases, such as biomethane or biogas worldwide. My question would be, what kind of measures would you recommend to use the best of the different energy sources to move forward into this more sectorial integration for the energy sector? And my second point is linked with the investment needs. In your presentation, we saw that the world is not investing enough to meet its future energy needs, with transition-related spending not rising fast enough to implement new clean technologies and deploy them. Investment have been announced in recovery plans in the US, in Europe, in many parts of the world, but it's not enough. How and what kind of measures could really change the scale for the deployment of these clean technologies and especially for green hydrogen? Thank you.
You want to say something, Tim, now, and then we take questions from the floor?
Yeah, sure. I can. I'd be happy to.
So I'm just going to change the background.
Oh, sorry.
Just keep going.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to Anne and Audrey for those remarks. I mean, I don't have any reaction except to say, thank you for the first set of remarks, which I thought were very, very perceptive and captured a lot of the challenges that we need to address. On the questions of what we need to do now, and how we can bring forward some of the technologies that we know that we'll need, that the business case is not yet clear. The issue is that the energy system's vast and it's very complex, and so it's difficult to point to any single set of measures that will work in every place. Clearly there are elements where you're dealing with mature technologies, where the technology risk is low, but you just need to have put in place policies that have been tried and tested in other environments in order to make stuff work. And the best example of that is perhaps getting more wind and solar into power systems. We know what needs to happen to get that sort of expansion in low carbon deployment. But you have very wide country by country variations in what actually happens in practice. One data point that I found particularly striking is if you look at all of Africa and all of the Middle East, as of the end of last year, utility scale solar deployment was around 10 gigawatts. And you could take one country in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, that put in place a vision for bringing in more renewables. It put in place power purchase agreements, so provided a degree of security on the remuneration of those investments, and did various other things to make sure that investors came through the door. And in Vietnam on its own, it deployed more solar than some of the most solar-rich regions on the planet. And that just speaks to the opportunities that are there with mature technologies to scale some of those up. But when the second part of your question is, what about the stuff that's not mature, where there's still technology risk? And there, you have to have a much larger role for governments, not just as the creators of policy frameworks, but also as the role for public finance to particularly blended finance, where you're taking on some of the risks that the private sector is not yet ready to bear. You're providing that initial support that allows costs to come down, that allows infrastructure to be put in place, that allows the business case for some of these new elements, particularly of industrial decarbonisation, to grow. And that's what you're seeing in practice in the hydrogen space. Governments are making commitments. You're trying to mobilize coalitions of buyers. There's a very interesting initiative which has been pushed by John Kerry to try and put together a so-called first movers coalition. Can you bring together companies that say, yes, I will commit to buying low carbon steel, or I will commit to buying low carbon cement, or I need this much low carbon hydrogen. And then that provides a demand pull that then gives investors the security to know that, if I build a new electrolyzer plant, if I build something, if I put in place some sort of steam reformer with CCUS to produce blue hydrogen, I know there's going to be a market for that. So you need some sort of coordination entity to try and align the interests then of the business side, the end consumers, and the governments. And you normally also need some money from the public purse to make it to get that off the ground.
Thank you, Tim. I have received a few, 2 or 3 questions in writing before we started, so I will start by calling Caterina on the right side of the room, and Giulio, please prepare on the left side behind the mic. And then progressively, if you wish to ask questions, line up behind the microphones so that we can have a smooth alternation of right and left. Please.
Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. My question is how you would assess the risk of a major skill gap preventing us from reaching net zero goals, meaning that even if we are able to close the investment gap, there won't be enough technicians, engineers, just in general skilled manpower to renovate our buildings, build up enough solar and wind? Yeah, how do you assess this risk? Thank you.
You want to
No, do we group a little bit more?
Giulio.
Okay. My question will be, in chapter 6 of this year, you highlighted some of the issue of an ever more complex energy supply and energy grid that are going to be created if you are adding to decarbonization. And also you highlighted some of the issue that we need to respond to. So creating climate change, resilience grids, and so all these challenges require a ever more complex public institution, private institution, ever more complex infrastructure. And so my question will be, do you think that there could be an issue, especially in the developing world, in creating this infrastructure that are needed going forward? And if yes, what could be the solutions to that? Or if not, what is the way forward for these countries?
Tim, thank you, as always, for your brilliant presentation. Two questions, one from the beginning of your presentation, one from the end. At the beginning, you highlighted, and we all have it in mind, the importance of the coal and basically limiting its impact. We have recent and repeated news pointing out that China and India are relaunching coal. Is what you pointed out rightly as a priority going to happen? Can it happen? That's my first question. My second question is on page 11, if I'm not mistaken. They were stricken by the relatively small size of solar versus hydrogen and storage. Is that due to an expectation that the cost of solar will drastically further diminish? Or is that because relatively to hydrogen, storage, and so on, solar becomes perhaps relatively, again, less important?
Can I just clarify on the second question? So you're looking at the share of solar in what? In the whole energy system or in?
In the investment, if I remember right, in page 11, in your slides.
I'm starting to regret making this available for free, to be honest, Professor Luciani.
Sorry, in the slides that you presented, there were relative investments, and I was stricken by the relative small size of solar, but maybe I misunderstood.
Yes, so you're talking about the market size of the equipment, so the solar modules. Yes, okay. Well, I think I'll probably start with that question. It's essentially because the solar modules become, relatively cheap. They are already relatively cheap, and as you move further down that path towards net zero, the costs continue to come down. Although we have to be very aware that, over time, the share of raw materials in the overall cost of a module starts to creep up. And so you have to watch very carefully then the supply chains for some of the elements that go into a solar installation to make sure you don't get inflationary pressures from that side. I think there's also a factor that at a certain point you do reach a level of deployment that is it's not completely saturated, but it's you're pushing this the solar quite hard. Whereas on the battery side, that was the largest component of that equipment calculation, and that's really a reflection of there's an irreducible cost to some of the battery technologies that when you multiply by all of the things that you're going to need at utility scale, but also all the things you're going to need at household level, that adds up to a large number. The coal question is, I think, another very good one. And I think you're right to point out that, in times of strain on the system, governments often reach for familiar solutions. And coal is a large indigenous resource in many countries. You know roughly how to manage your supply issues. And so there is a tendency to reach for those solutions when times are tough. That said, coal is at a real disadvantage when it comes to options for new power generation. It is no longer, people who are, looking to sell coal-related equipment can no longer turn up and say, well, this is clearly the cheapest way for you to meet your energy needs. It's no longer that argument that you need coal for energy access. It doesn't hold water anymore. So I think that those economic arguments still weigh heavily against coal, especially when you have populations that are increasingly concerned about the quality of the air that they breathe in the cities. That is a big political challenge for many parts of Asia, and you can manage it to a degree by putting sort of pollution control technologies on your coal plants, but still there's an awful lot of downside to those kinds of investments that I think are becoming increasingly clear to us with the changes that we're observing in the climate. The first question, I think, is an exceptionally good one about the skills gap. So will we have enough qualified people? That's something that we're looking at much more closely now in the agency. We've sort of added on an employment module to our world energy model. And we're also focusing much more on it in our dialogue with our member countries and indeed with others. We set up a thing called the Global Commission for People-Centered Inclusive Transitions. I think I may have got the name wrong. But the idea is to try and think through what this change means for people. And one of the key insights from that, we're going to be releasing the results, I think, later this week, is that you need to map out very clearly what sort of skills that you will need. You need to have a very clear understanding of the sorts of gaps that might emerge, and you need to intervene early to make sure that you get the sorts of skills that you think you're going to need for that transformation. And it's slightly more than that as well, because once you know what your strengths are, you can also adapt your technology choices to play to those strengths. I mean, a good example is in Scotland, for example. You have a large offshore industry, and it's unsurprising there, Phil, that from the perspective of the Scottish administration, it makes sense to move into offshore wind. I mean, you have the resource, but you have some of the skills that can be adapted then to develop that resource. So governments are trying to think through, am I going to rely on technology X, which is completely new for me, and where I would have to build up my position in the value chain from scratch? Or even if it comes at a little bit of a cost premium, is it better for me to focus on technology Y, where I really feel that I can get a lot of domestic value from that? And I think governments are increasingly thinking in those terms about some of the choices that they make. You move away quite quickly from the sorts of insights that you get from, large optimization models of the energy system, which just tell you what the cheapest solution is. The cheapest solution isn't necessarily the one that's going to answer the sorts of, the questions about what's best for employment in a given jurisdiction. Now then, ever more complex systems, how do we manage that? Let's just be clear what we're talking about here. So essentially at the moment, you have a sort of unidirectional set of channels that deliver energy to consumers. So oil, extraction, refineries, sent to petrol stations, we pick it up. Gas, likewise. It's a sort of channel that brings from the earth through gas processing and then to consumers. And electricity, likewise. But what we're talking about in the future is a system that, from a consumer perspective, might actually be more concentrated. You're more likely to be reliant on electricity. But behind, there's an awful lot more going on, because that electricity, it might be transformed in and out of batteries on its way to you. You might be having to manage many more distributed points of generation along the way. You might be managing also the solar on your roof. You might well be managing some of your energy needs through the way that you recharge your electric vehicle. And so making all of that fit together is not simple. And there is a lot of hope then for digital applications that will allow us to pull all that together in a way that makes sense. And the companies that are engaged in putting together those platforms, that's again a huge growth area for the future. Now, that's a sort of technology solution. It's not one that fills a lot of people with a sense of bring it on. I mean, that's a lot of people feel a sort of sense of foreboding when they imagine that someone is going to be able to alter the temperature in their room just because, or the way that their fridge operates, or something because that corresponds to the needs of the system. But we will be moving towards where some of those choices will be automated, and the way that you meet some of your energy needs will have to take into account the broader needs of the stability of the system. How does that work in developing economies is an extremely good question, but I don't think it's an insuperable one. In the case of India, for example, you will naturally move towards a set of technology choices that allow you to manage variability. In India, the big task is to move electricity from that midday peak in solar to the early evening peak in electricity demand. And batteries can play an important role there. It's just a natural fit for those kinds of needs. And I think that if you have some price signals as well, they can be very influential in shaping the way that consumers thinking about managing some of that variability as well. But I completely agree that this is a challenge that I think is underappreciated. I don't think we yet have the institutions or all of the solutions that we would need to manage that. And so that's an area we're very focused on.
Thank you, Tim. We will need to finish very promptly at 7, so I would suggest to take the 5 questions that are waiting in the wings and then perhaps stop there. We start from this side because there are 3 there and 2 on the other side. Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation and your answers. I'm just quite surprised because if I'm not wrong, you didn't say a word about the nuclear energy. So why didn't you speak about it, and what is your point of view on the role it has to play in this renewal of energies? Thank you.
Salome.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. My question concerns the power-to-X solutions, because according to the outlook, on the one hand, we have the rising share of renewables, according to all scenarios, and on the other hand, we have the trend that by 2050, all end users should be using the energy that has been converted at least twice. So is the interconnection between these two trends the power-to-X solutions to, in a way, offset the dispatchable nature of renewables? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I just got a question. So recently, you have the French President Macron who's really pro the development of small and medium nuclear reactors, and as I got the impression of you didn't really mention a lot about nuclear in the future energy mix. Would you be able to make some comment on the scenario that Macron was proposing?
Okay, so thanks again. 2 questions on my side. Maybe you can answer one or both. The first one was, we mentioned clean energy transitions can cushion customers from shocks of price spikes of oil and gas. But on the other side, the clean energy transition is making them susceptible in a way to to energy imbalances. Because I think in principle everyone agrees that we need to move away from oil and how we've been doing things until now. But when we talk about solutions, we mention wind and solar, very rarely batteries, and there doesn't seem to be a sustainable way. I know we mentioned the Texas effect, and we said we should not blame them on renewables, but then again, it was kind of the reason why. And then the second question was, maybe I don't know if this is actually covering the 60% of other ways to reduce emissions, but I remember when I was studying climate change economics, we would always talk about carbon capture technologies, and I've never seen them mentioned since then. So I don't know whether it's because they are not sustainable or not used or not, let's say, envisioned anymore, but I would like to hear a bit about that. Thanks.
We take that and then...
Lastly, and again, thank you for your presentation. In the past week, some of the news, the headlines from the Financial Times and the New York Times are that, for example, in order to achieve a net zero transition, investments in low carbon projects in poor countries will need to total more than 1 trillion a year, more than 6 times the current rate of investment of 150 billion. Moreover, state-owned oil companies in the Middle East, North Africa, and Latin America are taking advantage of the cutbacks by investor-owned oil companies by cranking up their production. Moreover, and I think just yesterday or the day before, a group of international companies, including Amazon and IKEA and others, have committed to using only zero-emission ships to transport their cargo by 2040. But unfortunately, no zero-carbon fuels are at present available in the quantities needed to decarbonize the entire shipping industry. And lastly, and I'm sorry, just a few hours ago, Brussels decided to delay the decision on how to classify nuclear power for green finance. So my question is, will we be able to keep up with the speed needed in order to have the right tools in time? Or how much of this whole, let's say, recent wave of pledges is just greenwashing? Thank you very much.
Okay, one last one from here. Speak up.
Sorry, I can't make it to the mic, but I really appreciated your presentation, but you really focused heavily on emission mitigation. I'm wondering, how does the WEO account for resiliency and adaptation to energy systems? Because as more emissions get introduced into the atmosphere, energy systems are increasingly vulnerable to disruption, and energy security, which is the IEA's primary mandate, becomes increasingly more expensive and difficult to ensure. So how do you account for increased investment into supply chain resiliency, infrastructure resiliency, and even climate adaptation? Thank you.
Tim, your challenge is to answer.
No, you have a
7 minutes.
7 minutes. All right. So first on nuclear, I mean that's my oversight. So I'm just I should always speak about nuclear in these on these occasions, and I didn't today, and it wasn't because I don't believe in it, because I happen to think that it has an important role to play. There's 2 issues here, particularly in advanced economies. We have an aging fleet of reactors. By 2040, 75% of the reactors in advanced economies will be more than 50 years old. So that potentially removes a very significant chunk of our existing low emissions generation from the system. There is a case to look at lifetime extensions for those reactors where appropriate. And in terms of new technologies, there's 60 gigawatts of new nuclear under construction at the moment, but we have to recognize that this kind of very large capital-intensive investments with long lead times, it's not a great fit in many countries for the way that we are moving with our electricity systems. And that's why there is, in a sense, a gap in the market for the sort of smaller, more modular reactors. They seem to fit better with the sort of electricity system that we will that we are moving towards in the future. So they do play a role in our scenarios. I think there was a number of questions dealing with different aspects of sort of variability and flexibility in the future. And that is indeed what a lot of the design of future energy systems needs to be all about. It is managing the variability that comes from sort of weather-dependent sources of generation on the electricity supply side. But it's also managing the potential increase in variability on the demand side as well of the electricity system. Because if you don't get the policies right and you don't get efficient air conditioning in place, and then if in the evening everyone comes home and turns on their air conditioners and wants to recharge their electric cars at the same time, you're going to be putting enormous strains on the power system. So that dual challenge of managing variability on the demand side and on the supply side is really the key to a lot of the questions, a lot of the complexity that was mentioned by our earlier speaker. And so some of the conversions that have also been talked about, like sort of power to X, that is in practice, that's a way to manage some of these variability challenges, because you're turning the power when you have it into things that you can then are much more, they're much easier to store, and then you can bring it back into the system when you need. So I think that encapsulates, I think, a lot of the things that need to be done. Carbon capture, I didn't really mention it today. Again, it is important. It's important when you think about a net zero emission system for a few reasons. There are some things that are just very difficult to know how you do unless you're capturing that. And the cement industry is always one that comes up. There are no really obvious technology solutions for managing emissions from some heavy industrial sectors without carbon capture. It's important from a political economy perspective. Are you really going to have, if you're looking at that existing stock of emissions from power generation, are you really going to be able to go to a country and say, actually, you've got to retire the lot? Is that a manageable thing? It happens in all sorts of modeling scenarios, but is that really a manageable thing for a country to take on? And so that's why, when we look at what happens to coal-fired plants in some countries, we have a sort of three-pronged approach. You can readapt those plants to provide flexibility, which is, again, a commodity, something that you need a lot of. You can co-fire them with ammonia or with other low-carbon fuels to bring down emissions. You can retrofit them with CCUS, and then also, particularly for the least efficient, they do need to be retired. But I think you need to have in mind that there's a sort of portfolio of approaches there as well. And then the last thing is you need to produce low-carbon hydrogen, and one of the easiest ways to do that is through steam reforming of natural gas with carbon capture. And that is one way, particularly in the early years of hydrogen, to bring in large volumes of low-carbon hydrogen into the system. And finally, we need to be talking about carbon removal technologies. So we need to be talking about the possibility of direct air capture. And direct air capture only works if you've got a way to store or use the carbon. Resiliency and adaptation, it's another great topic. We try and incorporate elements of that. So cooling demand, for example, in our scenarios, takes into account the fact that temperatures rise in certain parts of the world. We have to take into account the impact of rising temperatures on the performance of power systems, areas of extreme water stress, cooling systems that are used in thermal power plants. So that's all kind of integrated into the model. What we don't yet look at in massive detail is, the spending that's required on adaptation. But we do have a section in, since everyone's familiar with our chapter structure, chapter 6, on looking at what are the vulnerabilities that cyclones or rising sea levels pose to some of our current infrastructure. So I think that's an area which we're increasingly looking at. But I mean, it's a great point, and I think anyone who looks at the, again talking the AR6 physical science report, one of the conclusions that you reach from that, or at least for me, two of the biggest insights from that was the importance of methane, and then we need to be talking seriously about resiliency and adaptation. And one, if I can, I think there's one more about all of these sort of headlines that have been in the last few weeks. I was pleased to see that one of them is just quoting our own analysis, by the way. I think that governments are serious? I think that was the essence of the question. There is a credibility gap. There is an ambition gap. There is a sort of a question mark about implementation. Yeah, we're aware of that, and the variety in our scenario outcomes points to different ways of thinking about all of those potential weaknesses in the system. But in the end, you need to be optimistic about what we can do. I mean, we have achieved a certain amount since Paris was signed, as you saw from the opening slide. We're going to achieve a certain amount more in Glasgow. That's not the end of the road. Glasgow, amongst the things that it needs to do, in my opinion, most urgently, is to not, we're not going to solve the problem there, but we may be able to agree a process that just keeps the door open for further action, continues to put pressure on governments, on investors, on others to up their game in future.
Thank you very much. We are bang on time. Thank you for your attention. And of course, all of this has been streamed and will be and recorded and will be made available later on. Thank you.